All right, tough news coming out of New York. Superstar Aaron Rodgers went down with a complete tear of his Achilles injury. At the time of recording this is about 1:30 on Tuesday, September 12th. So we just got this information a couple hours ago that there's an MRI confirmation that there's a complete tear. Okay, so this video, first we're going to go over the mechanism of injury. What happened to get us to where we are right now? Next, we're going to go over Aaron Rodgers' injury history, which is actually very relevant to where we are right now. Okay, after that, we're going to go over a brief physiology and anatomy lesson on the Achilles. What should it look like, and what does it look like now, and what are some aspects that go into this injury that had happened? Next, we're going to go over the surgery. So what actually happens when a surgeon goes in and fixes the Achilles? We're going to talk about that. Next is my field. I'm a physical therapist. We're going to talk about the rehab process. How are we going to get Aaron Rodgers ready to get back on the field and start competing again? Next, we're going to go over the return to play. So what does it look like to take it from a rehab standpoint to actually getting back out there on the field? Because there are some steps that need to be taken. And then the last one we're going to talk about, which I don't think enough people are talking about, is Aaron Rodgers' unique throwing style. He's not like many other quarterbacks, and he has a very unique way of throwing the football. So we have a lot of topics to discuss and go over today. So let's start going over the mechanism of injury. All right, so on September 11, 2023, in the first quarter of the Monday Night Football kickoff opener, Aaron Rodgers was tackled by linebacker Leonard Floyd. Now, Leonard Floyd is 6'6" and 240 pounds. That's what he's listed as anyways. This happened when Aaron Rodgers was rolling out of the pocket. When he was getting tackled, there was a lot of pressure being placed on that left leg. As he stood up from the tackle, you could tell something was off. He was able to put weight down on there, but I think in his head, he realized, I have no power. I can't do anything with it. And that's because the Achilles at that time was ruptured. It wasn't connected to the calf anymore. So when he was sitting on the ground, his foot seemed limp, meaning that his foot was kind of sitting at an awkward angle when he was huddled with his knees, kind of like it was pointed up as if he was actively picking the toes up. And I don't think he was. I think that's because there was a lack of connection from the calf in that Achilles that has now ruptured. He was ultimately helped off the field by his teammates and then carted into the locker room. Probably could have walked, but would have been a waste of time. Let's just get things moving. So x-rays were negative, which I think threw a lot of people in the beginning because x-rays actually just look at the bones. You probably could see the Achilles a little bit in the x-ray, but for the most part, when we're looking at an image of an x-ray, we're just looking at the bony structure and the integrity of the bones. So really only a fracture would show up on an x-ray. We wouldn't see any information on the soft tissue surrounding there, which the Achilles is a soft tissue structure. Okay, so this is the mechanism of injury that happened. Now let's talk a little bit about Aaron's previous injuries that he's had in the past. Okay, so Aaron Rodgers' injury history is very significant, especially on that left side. Okay, a lot of reports are talking about the May 23rd injury that Aaron received in OTAs, which was a left calf strain. Okay, but what people aren't talking about is in 2006, Aaron Rodgers had a left foot fracture. In December of 2014, that led into January of 2015, Aaron Rodgers had a left calf injury. 2016, a left calf injury. In September of 2018, he had a left MCL injury and a tibial plateau injury on that left side. Okay, so all things happening to that left side. 2021, in the COVID lockdowns, when Aaron Rodgers was doing something on his own, he fractured his left pinky toe. That's a lot of trauma that's happened specifically to the calf, but the areas around the calf that might have changed his mechanics, the way he walks, the way he runs, the way he plants. Okay, so he's setting himself up for a future injury just based off his previous injuries. When we recover from an injury, we don't always recover to 100%. We get close, but someone like Aaron Rodgers that has to get back out there on the field, he might be dealing with an 80% recovery, and now this is extending into his career, this injury history. Essentially, it's adding up. And so that led up to this September 11th, 2023 Achilles rupture. Okay? Now, let's spend some time talking about the physiology and anatomy of the Achilles. Okay, so the Achilles tendon is a tendon, okay? By definition, tendons connect muscle to bone. So the Achilles connects the calf muscles to the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. It connects it to the foot, okay? There are two muscles that comprise the insertion in the Achilles. and that's the gastrocnemius and that's the soleus. Both of those form the calf muscle. Now, trying to do some research behind this has always bugged me as to why the calf was called the calf. From what I understand, way back in Greek physiology, they thought of the thigh, the quads and the hamstrings and the adductors. Those were the big meaty muscles, kind of like a cow would be, big and strong. And then the lower portion of the leg was the calf, like it was its younger offspring. Either way, that's all I got on the calf. If you know more information, please let me know because I'd love to know. Either way, the Achilles functions different than some other muscles in the body. It's what we call a type 2 lever. And type 2 lever, it functions like a wheelbarrow. For class 2 levers, the load is between the pivot and the effort. So think about lifting up that wheelbarrow. The effort's on the very end. The load is right in between the pivot point, which is where the wheel is. So it's the same thing with the calf, okay? And that helps with us with a mechanical advantage, meaning that we can relatively put more load through that area at a less effort in terms of our muscles. But conversely, there is a lot of load going through that Achilles to create that movement to happen. So there's been some studies that show that when we're running, we take about 3 to 8 times of our total body weight going through the Achilles. And if we're doing single leg jumping, that's 8 to 10 times our total body weight. So you have to think someone like Aaron Rodgers is probably about 200 pounds, somewhere around there. So if he's jumping on one leg, that might be 2,000 pounds of force going through that Achilles. That's quite a lot. Now there's another study from 1997, which I thought was pretty cool. It was by an author, Pollard, and his colleagues. But partial tears in the Achilles can happen at 4% of elongation, meaning if we stretch the Achilles to a 4% length, that's when we can start to see some tears of the Achilles. Now, a full and complete tear can happen at about 8% of length. So it doesn't take a lot for us to have these tears in our Achilles. So Aaron Rodgers essentially had the perfect storm. So he's running, which is that 3 to 8 times your total body weight. And then Leonard Floyd landed on him, which adds another 240 pounds on top of what he already had of his body weight. And if we watch the video, the calf was in an elongated position. And we can start to see damage happen at about 4% length. It looked like he was probably a little bit longer than that. So this is the perfect storm that probably led to Aaron Rodgers' Achilles tear combined with his prior injuries. We have to take note that the Achilles generates so much force that when it ruptures, people report that they turn around and said, "Who just kicked me in the back of my leg?" I personally had one of my friends tore his Achilles about 10 feet from me, and he turned around and said, "Why'd you kick me?" I actually wasn't looking at him at the time, and it made an audible thud, like a boom. Not like a pop, but a thud. And that's the sound of the tendon rupturing. It generates so much force. In some extreme cases, it actually pulls the skin with it with some fascial adhesions. So either way, I just think it's kind of cool in terms of the anatomy and the physiology of what happens with these tears. As physical therapists, as physicians, we do something called a Thompson test or a calf squeeze test, where we squeeze the calf. And if the Achilles is intact, because the calf, the Achilles attaches the calf to the foot. If the Achilles is intact and we squeeze it, we see the foot move. If we don't see that foot move, there's a break in the system and that Achilles is torn. Okay? That's what the physiology and anatomy of the Achilles looks like. Let's take a second to talk about surgery. Okay, so we know what happened with the Achilles. We know the anatomy and the physiology. Let's talk about putting it back together. Now, surgeons, these guys are super smart dudes, but we can take a step back, and these guys are kind of just like carpenters. They're just putting A and B closer together. So the Achilles that is ruptured and that is torn apart, they have to put it back together. It's as simple as that. Doing it, that's a different story. So it's typically an open surgery, which means that they will cut the back of the Achilles, that skin there, and open it up so they can get in and actually suture the Achilles back together. There's some surgeons that are doing it arthroscopically, but it's a thick tendon. There's a lot that goes into putting it back together, and because so much force generates through that area, most people are opting for that open surgery. So early surgery, I would imagine Aaron Rodgers is going to opt for surgery as soon as possible because the calf can actually start to retract and and contract away. And so that separation of the Achilles over time makes it harder to bring it back together. So if he was smart, he's going to step into the OR as soon as he can. So when we do this surgery, we try to get the Achilles in what I consider a Goldilocks zone, where you can't have too much or you can't have too little. And what that means is if the Achilles is too tight, if we put it back together and now it's too tight, we lost range of motion, and we're leading to another potential Achilles rupture in the future just because of that loss of range of motion and people trying to force it. Now that's too tight. If we're too loose, we lose that mechanical advantage of the wheelbarrow. You know, think about the wheelbarrow being too high off the ground and you can't lift it. So if the Achilles is too long, now we don't have a good enough ability to generate force, and now we have a lot of weakness in that area. We have too much range of motion. So we need that just right, where it's not too tight that we've lost the range of motion and it's not too loose that we have extra range of motion. So we want to maintain that mechanical advantage of the type 2 lever. And that's on the surgeon to try to find that Goldilocks zone and get it looking just like the other side. Okay, so that's the surgery. Let's take a second to talk about recovery and what it looks like coming back from this surgery. Okay, so recovery, this is my field, and I really love doing this part of things. When we're recovering from an Achilles injury, again, it's pretty important to get the timelines right. Typically, we have 6 weeks of non-weight bearing where you're in a cast or potentially a hard boot, but you're usually left in a position of plantar flexion, which just means the toes are pointed down towards the ground. Before I mentioned that we want to have the Achilles not be too tight but not be too loose. When it's healing after the surgery, it's generally pretty weak, so we don't want to put it in a position of too much stretch because then it can heal like that. So we'd rather let it heal a little bit tighter and through physical therapy and through training naturally lengthen it over time. So we'd be pointed down a little bit in the beginning. After that 6-week time frame of non-weight bearing, as we're letting that Achilles heal and come back together, we have 6 weeks in a walking boot, usually with a heel lift, for the same reason. We're trying to maintain a little bit of shortness that we can gain back later on in rehabilitation. Okay? So we want that Achilles to tighten a little bit. So as physical therapists, we're trying not to overstretch that Achilles to make sure that we maintain some elasticity of the area. So we gradually take off the heel lift. It's not like it's on there one day and then the next day it's gone. We might start with a full inch, then a 3/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, then eventually none, so that you're flat on the ground. Either way, for probably about 6 weeks, you'll be in a walking boot, so you're not pushing off of the Achilles. We're using what's called a rocker bottom boot, which takes care of that push off for us. Okay. Once we get out of that boot, then it's on us as physical therapists and as the patient to start strengthening the area. It's a long, slow build, and a lot of times we're measuring it compared to the other side. So we can use things like dynamometers, which actually give us an output, a read of how much force you're using to push, to pull, to move side to side. So that's going to be something that we utilize as physical therapists to make sure that we're about even on each side. Once we build the strength back up to being about even, that's when we'll start to move more towards plyometric movements, where we're going to start working on jogging, cutting, jumping, etc. That comes later on. And then once we return back to some of those movements, then we can start to work towards sport-specific movements, okay? And that timeline that I just went over usually brings us to about 9 months. But with this type of an injury, we want to, because the mechanical advantage is so important, we want to make sure we're taking our time and really hitting our milestones so that we don't send our athlete back out there too soon and he's either weak, too tight, or too loose. So a lot of things that we have to juggle and keep track of with this. Okay, and now let's take a second to talk about, after the rehab, how do we return to play? Okay, so now we're back to returning to play. We've got our rehab under our belt. We're strong. We're starting to generate force with movements. So what does it take for us to get back on the field? Something that we don't talk about enough. The last time that we were out on the field when we're recovering from something like this, an injury occurred. So there's quite a bit of a mental component that comes back out into this scenario. So we can't just go right from the rehab room onto the field. We have to simulate some game type scenarios and situations to help get us ready to get back onto the field, okay? And that takes a little bit of coaching. It takes a little bit of what we call mental reps, where we're going through the motions in our head, situations that we might not be able to do in rehab, but might happen on the field. I'm not a 300-pound defensive lineman that can come charging on him and replicate what's going on in the field, right? So some of that's going to be some mental reps of him just going over, what do I do when this happens? So agility, speed, and power are all things that need to be retrained, almost like we're starting from ground zero and working our way up, because that Achilles to his body is new. So we have to train it as if it's new and start from ground zero. Now, he will be able to complete some throwing motions, but we'll talk about this a little bit later. Aaron Rodgers has a unique throwing style, so we actually don't want to start encouraging bad habits. So we want to be a little bit careful about the volume and how much we're throwing. So we need confidence to return to play. That's the biggest thing, is confidence out there in the field. We can get that Achilles physiologically as ready to go as it can be, but that's half the battle. The other battle is that mental component, and that needs to be worked on quite a bit when it comes to rehabilitating an injury like this. Okay, now let's take a quick dive into Aaron Rodgers' unique throwing style. Okay, so most people know that Aaron Rodgers doesn't throw like a typical quarterback. The easiest comparison I can make across sports is Aaron throws the football kind of like a tennis player swings a tennis racket. So most people look at him and think Aaron Rodgers jumps when he throws the ball. In my opinion, that's not really what's happening. The jumping isn't purposeful. It's kind of a side effect of what he's doing. So we look at a tennis player swing a tennis racket. Say we have a right-handed tennis player hitting a forehand, which would replicate a right-handed quarterback throwing the ball. So we're generating force from the right side, but the left side at the same time is also doing something. In my opinion, I call this a block leg, which means it's blocking the momentum from moving forward. A little bit different from a baseball player or a baseball pitcher where you'll step through and come up and over that leg. The tennis player will want to block the movement going forward. So they'll be strong on that left leg as they're powering through with the right leg. So it's kind of like two waves coming together and crashing and lifting the momentum upward. We got backwards momentum from the left leg, frontwards momentum from the right leg causes the feet to leave the ground. It's similar to what Aaron Rodgers does when he throws the ball. Okay, so most people are saying, well, he'll be okay because it's not his right leg. That's where he generates most of his power. That's true, but he's also generating quite a bit of power through his left leg. So it is relative to his recovery that we work some of these throwing mechanic movements. Okay, so the surgery, as we talked about, needs to place that Achilles in that Goldilocks zone so he can maintain the power in that quote-unquote block leg so he can get back out there in his normal mechanics. So as the two legs are counteracting each other, it kind of creates this torque through his body that his arm just snaps through at the end, and that's what releases the ball, which is different than other quarterbacks that step into the ball and then more traditionally like a baseball player. So again, Aaron Rodgers is more like a tennis player. It's also beneficial because if consequently from his throwing mechanics, his feet leave the ground, if he does take a hit on his lower body, if his feet are planted on the ground, it could spell danger for his knees, his hips, his back, his ankles. If they're elevated, they just kind of get swept out from underneath him. Now he might take an awkward fall, but for the most part, it's a good thing that his feet are not on the ground when he gets hit because he can absorb that impact a little bit differently. So it's going to be very important to retrain that left leg so he can maintain his throwing form. At 39 years old, going into next season, 40 years old, we don't want to have a complete overhaul of his throwing mechanics because I think that's where he's going to run into trouble returning back to the field. So this recovery on his left side is going to be very important. He's mobile, but becoming like a Brady-esque quarterback where he's strictly a pocket passer and not making some out-of-pocket movements, I think it's just asking a lot of the quarterback to change his entire game plan. Okay, so let's wrap things up. We've talked about a lot of different topics. Basically, the injury occurred from an accumulation of prior injuries, as well as that perfect storm of a lot of load and a lot of stretch on the Achilles. So the surgery needs to be successful, or needs to successfully place that Achilles in that Goldilocks zone where it's not too tight, but it's not too loose. It's just right. So the recovery timetable is conservatively 9 to 12 months. Players like Cam Akers have come back in 6 months. Kobe did it in 8. Aaron Rodgers is older than both of them. So we're going to probably conservatively say 9 to 12 months is a good timeline. Don't be surprised to see Aaron Rodgers doing things like stem cells, platelet-rich plasma injections, whatever else he can get his hands on, because I think he's going to try to get back out there on the field. And we have to keep in mind that Aaron's unique style of play and his throwing mechanics need to be considered in his rehabilitation process. And he's not going to have to go through normal throwing mechanics like another quarterback because he doesn't have those. He has his own unique ones. So everybody, thanks for tuning in and watching this video. If you like this video, consider subscribing to my channel and consider liking the video. I'll have more content coming out soon, and we hope that this guy gets back out in the field because it's just good for football. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you have any questions, drop me a comment. We'll go from there. Thank you.